Coming up, basically the conclusion of the impeachment after that incredibly effective use of video by the Trump team was that car rental counter scene with Steve Martin as the Democrat impeachment managers and the voting senators portraying the smiling, rosy-cheeked female rental agent. Here's how I envision the impeachment through the lens of that scene. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, I've said many times on this podcast that I'm a film buff. I have a number of movie scenes over the years that I count among my favorites. But this week I have to add some to my list. Okay, I'll admit that they're not really movie scenes that I want to add to the list, but they are videos. And I've enjoyed them as much or more than just about any movie I've seen in quite a few years, which is surprising because these scenes appeared in something I haven't enjoyed in the slightest. I have a feeling some of you out there have already figured out where I'm going with this. Not surprisingly, I haven't enjoyed watching the impeachment coverage. The entire proceeding has been a monumental waste of time. As I've said before, I don't believe it's constitutional to impeach a former president. The precedent that doing so sets is a threat to the future functioning of our government. Are impeachments going to become standard operating procedure in the future when there's a split between control of Congress and the White House? We'll see. But notwithstanding the fact that Donald Trump should never have been impeached, not the first time and not the second time, for a few minutes I was so entertained this time around that it almost seemed worth it. After watching the Democrat impeachment managers decry then-President Trump's purported calls for violence, often in the form of calling his supporters to fight, that's right, using the word fight, which, as we all know, is not a term that means to do your best to win a battle, whether it's a political contest, a debate, or an election. It means, actually, it can only mean for the Democrat impeachment managers, a call to physical combat, storming of buildings, assaulting police officers. If you listen to the Democrat impeachment managers when you use the term fight, you're either calling for an assault on the Capitol building or perhaps a visit to a chain-link octagon. Either way, it's certainly something in their view that shouldn't be said by a politician. After listening to that, I was entertained by a seemingly endless string of clips of Democrat politicians honoring that now dirtiest of words, fight, including in several instances calling for or glorifying fighting, quote, in the streets, close quote. I always love those montages. They're constantly used on cable news to demonstrate that politicians and the news media, often seemingly in coordination, and I'm being very gracious in using the word seemingly, tend to speak in narrative, often using the same terminology, the exact same terminology, often used in party talking points. But this was even better because it was oh so sweet to see the hypocrisy of Democrat leadership on such obvious display, helping undermine their pursuit of an impeachment that never should have happened. But as good as the fight term videos were, two more were even better. And as I mull over some of my favorite movie scenes from over the years, the car rental counter scene from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, the hair gel, so to speak, scene from There's Something About Mary, the Orange Bird restaurant scene from Green Book, the Tommy Gun in the Rain scene from Road to Perdition, and the ending of Shawshank Redemption. Sure, the Trump legal team didn't put on a performance on par with the actors in those films, but the analogy really isn't to actors, but rather to directors and writers. Donald Trump's lawyers watched the performance of the Democrat impeachment managers and all the scorn they were heaping on our former president, and Trump's lawyers basically directed the film that was the video equivalent of a crowd at a college football game in a full stadium in the pre-COVID era, of course, screaming bullshit in unison at a blown ref's call. Trump's lawyers basically facilitated a booth review of the video, only in this case, the video that showed the blown call was that of all the Democrats saying things that are on par with President Trump's statements, and in many cases using more negative, make that more expressive, make that more aggressive terminology than President Trump. We all knew it was coming. We watched the hypocrisy on display for 4 years. President Trump would say something unpresidential, and the media would commence their spasms of pearl-clutching and fainting spells. Meanwhile, Democrat politicians, including Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and members of the media would talk about punching the president, getting in the faces of members of his cabinet, and preventing them from eating at restaurants or gassing up without being accosted and told they're not welcome anywhere, joking about Trump not making it out of an elevator alive, and the vast majority of the media would sit silent or even in some instances applaud them. But there was more. Democrat impeachment manager Congressman Joaquin Castro asked Americans to ask themselves whether they've ever seen a politician other than Donald Trump claim that the only way they could lose was if the election was rigged and stolen. Well, the video showed Congressman Castro asking that question and then showed Democrat Senator Sherrod Brown and Hillary Clinton doing exactly that. And then it showed Democrat after Democrat claiming that President Trump was an illegitimate president. So after 4 years of those claims and that verbiage, with Democrats contending that Trump's verbiage was over the top, these 4 years of Democrat hypocrisy, all captured on video, came rushing back. And the practical effect of it was the same as Steve Martin in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles tearing up his rental contract because his car wasn't in the designated spot, and then sliding down a snow-covered embankment and walking across the runway to get to the rental counter to let out strings of F-bombs while demanding a rental car. Basically, the conclusion of the impeachment after that incredibly effective use of video by the Trump team was that car rental counter scene, with Steve Martin as the Democrat impeachment managers and the voting senators portraying the smiley, rosy-cheeked female rental agent. Here's how I envision the impeachment through the lens of that scene. Fair warning here, if you haven't seen Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, you might not get this. And if you haven't seen it and you're looking for a good comedy, definitely watch it. Welcome to the Senate. May I help you? Yes. How may I help you? You can start by wiping that f***ing dumb smile off your rosy f***ing cheeks. Then give me a f***ing conviction by f***ing 2/3 or f***ing 3/4 or f***ing unanimous. 16 f***ing Republicans and Mitt Romney, too. I don't care for the way you're speaking. And I don't care for the way Trump's defense team left me f***ing embarrassed with a video of my f***ing Democrat colleagues showing that my case wasn't f***ing there. I didn't care to f***ing walk across the f***ing Capitol and across the f***ing Senate chambers to get back here to have you smile at my f***ing face. I want a f***ing conviction right f***ing now. May I see your unrebutted evidence? I don't have any. Oh boy. Oh boy, what? You're f***ed. And in the end, the Democrats and their impeachment managers, like the Steve Martin character, were f***ed. Well, that definitely set a personal record for my use of the popping cork censoring sound. Next topic. Is the press returning to journalism? Is the press biased in favor of the Biden administration? Yes, of course they are. Is the press treating the Biden administration with even a scintilla of the scorn and skepticism they directed at the Trump administration? No, of course they aren't. Is the press so far living up to my characterization of them as the propaganda arm of the Democrat Party? Yep, unfortunately, they are. Is there any reason to believe that they might turn around, at least a bit, and perhaps begin to function ever so slightly as actual journalistic enterprises? Maybe. Look at what happened this past week in Biden's Office of the Press Secretary. His deputy press secretary, T.J. Ducklo, had entered into a personal relationship with a reporter for Axios, Alexi McCammond. She'd been covering Biden's campaign and was still covering the administration. The relationship had apparently not been disclosed to the public in connection with her work, notwithstanding the fact that it certainly seemed to create a conflict of interest of which the public should be made aware. Well, a reporter for Politico, Tara Palmieri, was exploring that very issue. She was asking questions about the relationship. Now, keep in mind that Joe Biden, dating back to his campaign as well as after assuming office, has been sharply critical of the treatment of the press by President Trump and members of his administration. He even committed to fire any member of his administration who treats, quote, another colleague with disrespect, close quote. So how did his deputy press secretary, T.J. Ducklo, respond to questions about his relationship with an Axios reporter who'd been covering the Biden campaign and was still covering the administration? He's reported to have called the journalist who spoke to the Axios reporter about him and said, quote, I will destroy you, close quote. That's right. The deputy press secretary in the administration of Joe Biden, who'd committed to fire anyone who treated a colleague with disrespect, called up a reporter asking legitimate questions about him and apparently said something that made him sound more like a Bond villain than a press secretary. But there's more. It's reported that Ducklo contacted the female journalist, Palmieri, to make the threat, even though it was a male Politico reporter who had asked him the questions about his relationship, and Palmieri had only talked to his girlfriend, the Axios journalist. When Ducklo called Palmieri, in addition to threatening to destroy her, he purportedly claimed that she was simply jealous because another man had previously wanted to have sexual relations with the Axios reporter who was now dating Ducklo, rather than pursuing Ms. Palmieri. That's what Ducklo purportedly told her. That, of course, leads to allegations that Ducklo's comments were sexist because he actively sought out the woman who was pursuing the matter rather than the man who contacted him, and then made allegations casting aspersions on her professionalism, even though she was making an obviously legitimate inquiry. And he appeared to be operating on the belief that rather than being a professional, she must be functioning more like a vindictive, scheming female character in a Hollywood drama. So what did the Biden administration do? Initially, nothing. But then the reports about what happened came out, and then Press Secretary Jen Psaki suspended Ducklo for a week without pay. Ducklo also released a statement describing his own language as, quote, abhorrent, disrespectful, and unacceptable, close quote. I've also found nothing indicating that he disputed the assertions about what he said. The press pressed Jen Psaki about the suspension. They questioned whether it met President Biden's commitment to fire any member of his administration who treats another colleague with disrespect. And then, abruptly, Deputy Press Secretary T.J. Ducklo announced that he had resigned his position and that he would not be returning from the suspension. The White House issued a statement confirming that, quote, we accepted the resignation of T.J. Ducklo after a discussion with him this evening, close quote. So why do I bring this up? Well, this is an example of actual journalisming, if that were a word, being done. It's actually an example of the press conducting inquiries, investigating whether a politician and his staff are keeping the politician's commitments. It's an example of speaking truth to power. So there's reason for encouragement. Does it give me unfettered optimism that the press might actually begin to do its job? No, unfortunately not. And I say that because the subject here is treatment of the media. It's sort of inside baseball in the extreme. Even Politico asking the original questions about Ducklo's relationship with the Axios reporter, while absolutely appropriate questions to ask and the kind of thing that any journalist should investigate upon hearing claims of its existence, even those original questions could have been motivated, at least in part, by a desire to expose a competitor's conflict of interest. There's nothing wrong with that motivation, it just seems less worthy of celebration. Moreover, once Ducklo responded, as he reportedly did, it would seem the motivation of the press to dig further into the story was more about protecting themselves than about informing the public. Once again, the subject was entirely appropriate and should have been investigated, but the motivation was perhaps less worthy of celebration and also less likely to be an indication that the press will necessarily begin to actually act as journalists in covering the administration. They may, in fact, start to act as journalists, but we'll have to wait and see. Do I think there's any chance, even a fraction of a chance, that they'll cover the Biden administration with the belligerence and unprofessionalism that they directed at President Trump and the members of his administration? Not a chance on earth. Next topic. China population crash. If there's one thing which we always think of when we think of China, it's people, population, millions upon millions upon millions of Chinese citizens. It's always been that way, at least in my lifetime. Go back to the Korean War when China entered it against the U.S. after MacArthur pushed perilously close to the Yalu River that formed the border with China. What was shocking about it was not just that China entered the war, but that it did so with 1 million soldiers. 1 million soldiers poured over the border. But it looks like what we think may need to change. Now, it's always difficult to predict well into the future. People just have a tendency to adapt. They just have a tendency to change, to adjust. And predicting multiple decades out can be tough. But the predictions now for China are looking pretty eye-opening. The Hindustan Times, by way of Bloomberg, as well as multiple other outlets, are reporting that the number of newborn babies registered in China last year fell 15%. They reported that the population is aging faster than the majority of countries with developed economies around the world. Now, the article attributes much of the problem to the stringent one-child policy that China's maintained in the past, but it notes that the country began relaxing those restrictions in 2013 and increased the number of children allowed per family to 2 by 2016. Incidentally, anyone who tries to soft sell you on the authoritarian nature of the Chinese Communist Party, try to wrap your head around a government regulation which limits your right to reproduce, to limit you to 1 baby or 2 babies. Whenever you hear anybody talking positively about the Chinese approach to government, be terrified, very terrified. But notwithstanding the fact that the one-child policy is long gone, population growth in China is expected to tank. And by the way, they're far from alone in that respect. Forbes.com reported on September 3 that China's population is projected to drop by nearly 50% by 2100. In the same period, the population of the U.S. is expected to climb, but only slowly, increasing by a total of 3% by then. As I've said before in this podcast, population decline is more of a reason for concern in many respects than population increase. How do you provide for the medical needs of an aging population? How do you adjust to the reduced demands for goods and services from a shrinking economy? Think it's hard to achieve consistent economic growth over time? Now try it with a shrinking population. The two biggest questions are whether we can turn it around. Can we increase our birth rate to stave off the population collapse that appears to be coming for China and many other countries? And can they turn it around as well? And if they can't, what will they do? How will they react? Will it make them more or less of a threat? Well, those are some questions we'll discuss in future episodes. And the one thing for sure is that in the immediate future, the next episode of Political Spirits will be next week. As always, be sure to listen and tell your friends to do so as well. And like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. and select All after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.